Good morning at 7:34, and you're listening to Upfront. I'm Janine Eder. The Bay Area housing affordability crisis is hitting teachers. The Council of Community Housing Organizations and Bay Area Forward just released the findings of who will teach our children, identifying the housing and affordability levels needed for Bay Area educators to live where they work. For more, we're joined by Peter Cohen, the co-director of Council of Community Housing Organizations, a San Francisco-based association of affordable housing developers and advocacy organizations, and Susan Solomon, president of United Educators of San Francisco. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what prompted this report?
Well, we have been working with the United Educators, Susan's organization, for the last few years, and there's been a growing buzz in the Bay Area about educators, teachers, and the need for housing. And in several cities, we've heard stories about attrition rates, especially for young teachers, and difficulties with retention. But there hasn't been a real deep understanding of who are our educators, who are the people who teach our children, and what are their actual housing needs in a more data-driven way. So we started digging into this and, came up with this report to, in many respects, tell the story of who those folks are, not just your classroom teacher that we all think about, but also paraprofessionals and guidance counselors and nurses and, the building and ground staff, everyone who essentially touch our children's education over the course of, as we call it, from cradle to college. And that's what this report really tries to do, is shed some light on the issue and have a deeper understanding.
So what we've seen over the past, now many years, is that educators come to San Francisco or are in San Francisco, are eager to teach, want to get attached to their students and their schools, and then between student debt and housing costs, they just can't afford to stay. And so there is a higher attrition rate than there used to be. So the school district can attract qualified educators, but has a hard time retaining them. And one of our concerns is not just for the educators who have student debt, who are paying more than 30% of their income in rent, but for the students they work with. Because if they have to leave, we see staff turnover in schools. That's less stable for our students, and we don't want to see that. We want to be there for them.
And where is the study focused? Like, it's on San Francisco, San Mateo, Oakland?
Yeah, we use San Francisco and San Mateo counties as sources for the real deep data analysis. But I think sort of anecdotally, talking to folks around the region, the story is not a whole lot different. The actual income levels might be a little bit different district to district. Some of the housing conditions may go from, red hot crisis to difficult, but we think it really is emblematic of what's happening throughout the region, certainly in the urban core cities of the region.
And so you said you don't have a problem with attrition, but Susan, I wanted to ask you, have you seen trends of teachers leaving the Bay Area?
Right, there is a problem with attrition. There's no problem with attracting educators, but keeping them. So every year for at least 5 years, we've seen anywhere from 200 to 700 openings once summer hits that have to be filled. And so and much of that has to do with people simply not being able to stay. They have only a studio apartment above a bar, and even with that, they can't afford to stay. And so they leave the school district to try to find someplace where they can afford to live.
Are some of the teachers supplementing their income, like doing gig economy, like driving for Uber or Lyft?
Absolutely. And definitely with paraeducators or paraprofessionals, who are those critical classroom instructional aides who provide additional one-on-one services for students. Their incomes are lower than teachers. They mostly have part-time jobs with the school district. So they have 2 and 3 jobs. Many of them do.
And it mentions in your report that that there are almost too many jobs in the area, not for educators, obviously. For every 17 new jobs added in San Mateo County, only 1 new unit of housing is produced. And for every 13 new jobs added in San Francisco, only 1 new unit of housing is produced.
Yeah, and this is a core of the problem, not just educators, but across our workforce. There's been this tremendous economic boom in the last, let's say, 5, 6, 7 years, coming out of what folks call the Great Recession, and cities want to attract big revenue producing industries and businesses, but also jobs has always been sort of top of the ticket for electeds, and so there's been this kind of jobs, and it's been very successful. But the housing needs to accompany that job growth just simply haven't been operating at the same pace, or haven't even really been thought about. So this jobs housing imbalance is a core problem. And then when you unpack that further, which is really important, it's not just sort of one job needs one housing unit. These aren't just sort of chits. They actually need to be affordable to the workers themselves. So we use this framework in the report called a jobs housing fit. And it's really basic. I mean, we know what an educator makes. Susan's organization has the profile of their workforce, but also their salary ranges. And we can equate that to what their monthly rent can be without stressing their finances. And that's basically what the fit is for housing affordability. So we can say it's not just getting the right balance, it's also getting the right fit of housing that's affordable to that job growth. And that's really a problem right now everywhere, not just San Francisco and San Mateo counties.
And why the focus on teachers? I'm sure lots of other professions are having a hard time.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I'm sure Susan would agree that we're not sort of saying teachers are the only ones that matter, but it's certainly, again, the buzz around teachers and education. There's a great public empathy for our teachers, so we can use that workforce as a starting point to really understand what it's going to take to house all the folks who basically we take for granted in our daily lives. Whether it's the hotel workers or the baristas at the coffee place where I got my coffee this morning. There's a whole variety of workforce sectors that, most of us go through daily life, and we don't really think about the folks who touch our lives and what their housing situation is. So we're hoping to use the story and the analysis around educators with jobs housing fit to be able to say there's a larger issue here about housing our workers, housing our workforce.
And certainly this matters a lot to us as educators, because we know that if we are struggling, so must the families of our students, many of whom have the kinds of jobs that Peter was just describing, where they're not getting wealthy from their jobs. They're just barely scraping by. And we have seen families leave the city as well. So this would be either a pilot or a foot in the door for how do we implement, what's the model for affordable housing for workforce and working families. And we see some of what's going on now to be that.
And how many teachers are commuting, would you say?
It's about 30%, maybe a little more, about a third of the workforce. And what's significant about that is there have always been commuters, but they're commuting from farther and farther away. As Oakland becomes more expensive, as Daly City becomes more expensive, we have people coming from Pittsburgh, from Tracy, from Vallejo, Antioch, as do other workforces. And so for educators, that means longer commute means less time they are able to do after-school programs.
Yeah.
And how else does it impact the students? You were talking a little bit about when students see the turnover rate, how that impacts them.
So I feel like that is a big piece of it, where certainly when I was in school, I could pretty well figure that whoever the third grade teacher was going to be the third grade teacher for as long as I was there. And now some schools have, for example, this year, half of the education staff is new to the school. And so students can't necessarily rely on seeing the same faces they saw the year before. And for some, it means there are people coming in who are working hard, but they need to learn the culture of the school because they're new to the school.
Yeah, I mean, I have two children, one of whom just graduated high school. The other just is in middle school in San Francisco in the public schools. And, we were lucky. These aren't necessarily, flashy schools, but we were lucky because the teaching and the overall education staff was very stable for most of that time. And, that just creates such a comforting environment for the parents as well as the kids. And then we'd hear from other parents about, turnover rates in their schools, or there's a sub every other week, and it just really creates a lot of stress in everybody. So I just from a personal experience can totally understand what Susan's saying. If we don't keep our folks housed and able to come to school each day, we're all stressed out by that.
We are speaking with Peter Cohen, co-director of Council of Community Housing Organizations, and Susan Solomon, president of United Educators of San Francisco, about the new report, Who Will Teach Our Children? The housing affordability crisis hitting teachers. The housing was an underlying issue of many of the recent teacher strikes, correct?
I think so. That was, again, affordability. How do we keep people with our students, for sure?
Right.
But I want to add to that. I mean, I was asked recently, so what are the school districts going to be able to do about this? They're already cash strapped, and of course, wages are going to be the first thing. And I think my response is this is not just a bargaining table issue. We're trying to elevate the issue of educator housing, and for that matter, housing our workforce, to become a broader public policy issue so that each workforce sector doesn't have to hammer it out at the bargaining table of how they're going to have a roof over their head and a decent wage. So again, to what I said earlier, I think a lot of times we tend to take for granted folks in our community and not really think about what their situation is with their housing or how their wages are creating comfort or stress for them. So if we're lifting up this story of educators, then solving that housing issue is not just a school district issue. It's a larger public policy issue for city halls, for the voters, for all of us to figure out how do we keep these folks housed and capable in their jobs.
And to that end, we're moving in the right direction in San Francisco. There are a couple of initiatives that will be on the November ballot that directly address this. So an unprecedented $600 million housing bond, $40 million of which will be dedicated to educator housing from child care workers through community college instructors. And then there will also be an initiative that basically streamlines how to build affordable housing by making use of public land.
And what are some of the other solutions? You have listed in the report a number of programs that people can tap into.
Yeah,
our number.
In San Francisco, we often are trying to pave the way, but there are many programs in jurisdictions that have already been focusing on not just educators, but also sort of what folks call middle-income workers, typically around down payment assistance and homeownership assistance, and sometimes rental assistance. So we list those out in the report as kind of a menu of what's already out there to help folks either get into housing, ideally first-time home buying, or if they need rent subsidy. And then we talk a lot about this new initiative to actually build from scratch educator housing, which is costly, but it actually creates permanent housing that's dedicated for educators. So there's a whole variety of approaches, and they all require money, which means it all requires political commitment and the willingness of, whether it's voters or businesses to say, yeah, we're going to put some skin into the game and actually, put resources toward, if you will, subsidizing the needs for educators because the real estate market has left them out.
And I wanted to go back to some numbers in your report, and you were mentioning the full range of educators, not just teachers, but you have childhood educators caring for infants in daycare centers, teaching young students in preschool, elementary, middle school teachers, and other staff, city college instructors. What group is faring the best? And I see you have that page open to the report. It looked like high school teachers.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to say faring the best, I guess we could play with all kinds of scenarios. But if you say and Susan would really know the numbers. But I mean, we look at the comparison. If you have an educator household, maybe a pair of high school teachers who are tenured, and you put their income together, and they're being judicious about their spending. They're just about at the market rate for typical rent, but it's just about, sort of a finger scratch away. So, yeah, that might put them in the best situation, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily getting ahead of the game. But folks who are in other parts of the educator workforce are having much more difficult time. And we point out in here what's called an affordability gap. And it's really a kind of intuitive thing, but I think it helps folks understand if I can afford $1,500 a month for rent based on my actual income, but the rent for a typical one-bedroom apartment is $2,000, my gap is $500. So we can actually say what's the gap for all these different folks in the educated workforce. And some of them have a very small gap and others have a very large gap. But none of them don't have a gap. That's the point.
Right. And I would just add that teachers in San Francisco from kindergarten to 12th grade are all on the same salary schedule. The fact that high school teachers come out a little higher probably says that there are more high school teachers who have stayed longer. And that I'm not sure why, but that's what that would indicate to me, at least in San Francisco.
And where are the bulk of the teachers coming from that are the new teachers that students will be introduced to?
In terms of where they grew up, where they...
Generally speaking.
They actually come from all over the country. There are some who are local. In fact, new teachers who have been paraeducators in the school district, and there are a growing number of those due to some programs that help in a pathway, are more likely to be from the area. But, we see people coming from all over.
But it says that the affordability gap for California educators described in the 2019 EdSource special report notes that nowhere is the gap between teacher pay and housing costs wider than in the Bay Area.
I think there's I know because I've heard real sticker shock for people who come from other parts of the country, especially because where the cost of living is lower in Iowa, in Alabama, they come to San Francisco and see what looks like a really good salary if they were still home. And then they get here and find out that they're going to have a one-bedroom apartment for $3,200 a month, which is nothing like home. And that's where people coming from other states get sticker shock.
Yeah, and this is the sort of the irony or the inverse of a real booming economy. What's happened in the Bay Area is that, it's driven prices up, not just for housing, but so many things are now more expensive. So this wonderful place that people want to come to for all of its cultural and physical and other kinds of attributes has now become increasingly exclusive for so many of the folks, and the kind of culture that we think makes it such a great place. So we're in many respects, and this is where the larger discussion around gentrification comes in, that my organization's right in the middle of. How do we actually invest in our communities, but actually make sure everyone benefits and not have something that gentrifies out the very working class and lower income folks who we think are essential to our communities in the first place. There's no easy answer, but educators become, a real proxy for what happens when we end up having an overheated economy that doesn't actually take care of the essential folks that we want to keep in our communities.
It looks like it's a trend nationwide, though. I mean, as part of your report, it has articles from Arizona, Colorado, New Jersey, North Carolina, Texas, dealing with the same issue in terms of housing and affordability.
So over the last few years, as I go to national teacher and educator conferences and conventions, I've definitely started hearing more about affordable housing. I met a school social worker from Albuquerque who was talking about how housing costs are going up there. And to your point, it is becoming a national trend. Unfortunately, San Francisco has been leading the way and is still the most expensive city in the country for rents.
And it's really important here when we say it's a national trend, it's really an urban national trend. I mean, What we're seeing is that this is we call them hot markets. This is a place where real estate is really taken off. Investors want to be. You see a lot of job growth. And that's not just sort of spread like peanut butter across an entire state or a region. It's very concentrated. So, San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland increasingly. And if you look across the country, this is the city of Denver. It's not Colorado. And so that's the challenge, is we're finding, cities to be places where there's so much concentration of investment capital and wealth that it's pushing out a lot of the middle class and working class folks who we need in those communities. And so, that's where the crisis is. It's a national crisis of urbanism, and how do we get everything that we want in our cities? And that's, I think, very indicative of what's happened over the last 10 or 15 years when there's this back to city movement. Folks are kind of bored with the suburbs in many respects. But we have a lot of these kind of tensions, if you will, around affordability.
And I have a possibly somewhat uncomfortable question about ethnicity. I was wondering if there's any type of breakdown as to what teachers may be impacted the most. Is in terms of teachers of color? Is there in terms of housing affordability?
So I feel like we do have competing trends right now. So as I mentioned earlier, there are now a couple of different programs in the school district that make it possible for educators of color to get their credentials, to work while they move towards their credentials. Definitely seeing an uptick in teachers of color coming in through these pathways, as they're called. But at the same time, they also struggle with paying their bills more so than others because of what we all know, systemic institutionalized racism. And so it is definitely an issue.
Yeah, and Susan would know the educator community. I know we've done some research just on migration trends, and this is looking at San Francisco and if you just will, the migration in of workers or people and the migration out, and the net change. It's just absolutely correlates. There's two things happening. One is the primary in-migration is folks making more money. It's sort of middle and upper class folks. The out-migration is primarily working class and lower income. And then when you correlate that to race and ethnicity, we're basically out-migrating poor and communities of color. And that's really the trend we all see anecdotally. And many of those folks, when you put them into jobs, those are our hotel workers, our restaurant workers, our educators, the janitorial services, all the folks who basically make our daily lives comfortable are now pushed out of the city and living in farther and farther outreaches and commuting in. So there's a very perverse trend that's happening, and it's absolutely correlates with race and class.
And that's reflected in our students as well. In the diversity. So we have a diverse student population, but fewer African-American families live in San Francisco now than 20 years ago.
So are the teachers that are coming largely of other ethnicities?
So there are some, but again, it goes back to the issue of attracting teachers and retaining them.
Okay.
So they get here, but they can't stay.
And so what do you do with the gap in between the need and the housing being available?
We're trying everything we can. So Peter mentioned earlier about being at the bargaining table. So we have been successful in getting salary increases through bargaining. In the past 6 years, in fact, salaries for educators in San Francisco have gone up 32%. Which is a very high number, but keeping up with the cost of primarily housing, but other things as well, means even with that, it's hard to keep up. And so that's why we have to look at making housing more affordable legislatively through coalitions, housing coalitions and educator unions, families, communities, seeing what do we do around public policy to move this in the right direction.
And is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
Well, I would just say again, I think building on what Susan just said, this is about raising public consciousness, and that was really the impetus for this report, is to get this out of kind of an esoteric bargaining table thing about one community of workers and raising public consciousness that, this is a crisis, and if we don't all throw down for it, we're going to lose these people. And especially in communities like San Francisco or other parts of the Bay Area, a lot of folks pride themselves on, wanting diversity in their communities and feeling it's very important, and in many respects turning a blind eye to how that really happens. And so we're trying to say, if we want this to continue, we want these to be great places, we're all going to have to be part of that solution. And that requires money, political leadership, but also knowing who the people are in your communities and caring about them and doing what we can to help each other.
And how can people find this report?
Well, we have it on our website. It's www.sfccho.org. We have it posted there. And
can you repeat that one more time?
Yes, it's www.sfccho.org. And we'll have it there on the website. And anyone who wants to contact us at our office, we'd be happy to talk with you and send you the report.
We will also have a link at uesf.org.
esf.org. Well, we've been speaking with Peter Cohen, co-director of Council of Community Housing Organizations, a San Francisco-based association of affordable housing and developers and advocacy organizations, and Susan Solomon, president of United Educators of San Francisco. Thank you so much for speaking with me about your report, Who Will Teach Our Children, about the Bay Area housing affordability crisis.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.